很长时间以来啊，西方啊，由于意识形态偏见，很多人读不懂中国共产党。我记得18大召开前夕，英国广播公司 BBC 采访我，我坐下来，他问的第一个问题就是：“你觉得中国还会有19大吗？”后来我就笑了，我说：“你们对中国过去这么多年的这个政治预测，哪一次是正确的？哪一次是对的？我个人都记不起来。”今年是中国共产党成立100周年，世界正面临100年未有之大变局。如何理解中国共产党？如何理解中国道路？如何理解中国共产党中国道路和中华民族伟大复兴之间的关系？那么在这个节目里，我想我会对话西方学者，会邀请真正懂中国道路的一些专家，力求呢把中国共产党讲得清清楚楚。只有读懂中国共产党，才能读懂中国。
闪耀东方由世界因我而不同四特东方韵冠名播出。
The West should be making a serious attempt to analyze why it is the most successful political party of the modern era. The West believes China should be like the West. By this yardstick, China always fails because China can never be like the West.
How do we address of lies used to vilify the Chinese people and the Chinese government and the Chinese nation?
China will show by its own actions and its own achievements that these are lies. This is just deliberate deception.
西方主流的媒体和学界对于中国的观察还是带有一定的偏见的，这些偏见是否能被自然消解呢
？1996年2月的时候，当时呢西方媒体都在说中国即将崩溃，我觉得离谱离得厉害，他们没有读懂中国，所以就给亚洲华尔街日报投稿写这篇文章。我们最早在那个时候和所谓中国崩溃论开始了比战，还产生了比较积极的影响。大家好，欢迎大家收看江西卫视的《闪耀东方》。那么今天我们呢要讨论一个非常重要的题目，就是如何剖析西方对中国的误解。我们今天请来的这个嘉宾呢是我的好朋友，一位资深的学者，他现在是剑桥大学的客座研究员，也是我们中国研究院的这个访问教授，马蒂亚克先生。好，下边我们请Professor Martin Jacques, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Jiang Weiwei. It's great to see you again. The West does not understand China. The reasons could not be more fundamental. China's history and culture are entirely different from those of the West. We should not be surprised by this. The world, after all, contains countless different peoples and cultures. Why should they be the same or similar even? Well, there is a reason. The West, as we all know, has had a huge impact on the world since the late 18th century, primarily as a consequence of industrialization, colonization, and military superiority. In varying degrees, the West has shaped much of the world over the last 2 centuries. Of course, China suffered hugely during the century of humiliation, but it never became a colonial appendage of European countries, like happened in Africa or to India. Moreover, prior to the West's global domination, China enjoyed an extraordinary long and successful history of its own, which was marked by a powerful continuity. It is quite impossible to understand China unless you understand China's highly distinctive and powerful history. The West does not think like this. Western supremacy has taught it that every country and every culture should be based on the Western template. The West believes that its values and principles should apply to and inform every country. In short, they are universal. That is the Western mindset. They believe China should be like the West. And of course, by this yardstick, China always fails, because China can never be like the West, never has been, never will be. Let me give you a very contemporary example of this mentality. A fundamental underlying assumption on the part of the United States during the long period of relative harmony and collaboration with China between 1972 and 2016 was that as China modernized, it would westernize. It would become increasingly like a Western-style society and polity, as inevitable. But it didn't happen. It was a huge miscalculation, a consequence of Western hubris and arrogance. China will remain very different from the West. It has learnt much from the West, true, but it is overwhelmingly shaped by and a product of Chinese history and culture, of Chinese civilization. Now, nowhere is the chasm between Western and Chinese attitudes more evident than in their respective political systems. They are based on entirely different values and principles. In Western eyes, the legitimacy of any political system is measured by the extent to which they approximate to the Western norms of universal suffrage, a multi-party system, the separation of powers, and the rule of law. The West regards these norms as indispensable for good governance, believing that they represent the highest form of governance, which cannot be improved upon, and which is destined to last forever. The Chinese system, based on the Communist Party, is regarded as unrepresentative, unaccountable, and unsustainable. It will not survive. It will inevitably be replaced at some point in the future by a Western-style system. This is an extremely widely held view in the West. This dismissive attitude towards China has grown stronger since the downturn in relations between the US and China in 2016, following, of course, Trump's election. Where previously there'd been a willingness to acknowledge China's achievements, notably its remarkable economic growth and the huge reduction in poverty, China is now cast in an overwhelmingly negative light. The Chinese Communist Party is often described in the darkest Manichaean terms, representing all that is evil. Now, how do we explain this hostile tone? In the period 1972 to 2016, China was not seen as a threat to American global dominance. The idea that it might one day overtake the US as the world's dominant economic power, for example, was never entertained. The growing strength and confidence of China's governance, combined with the country's extraordinary economic transformation, persuaded America that China represented a mortal threat to its global hegemony. There is now a bipartisan attitude in the United States that China constitutes a deadly threat to its position in the world. Given that America regards its status as number one in the world to be a God-given right, this dismissive attitude towards China is likely to continue, alas, for a long time. The new mood displays some of the characteristics of the Cold War between 1947 and 1989, but it would be wrong to equate the two. This phase will only come to an end when the United States accepts China as an equal in the world. Such a shift is a long way off. We are talking about, I would think, at least 2 decades, perhaps more. The new hostility towards China is exemplified by the toxic attitude towards the Communist Party of China. We are witnessing a regression into the old cliches of the Cold War. No serious effort is made to understand the Communist Party of China. It is dismissed as a clone of the Soviet Communist Party. It is almost as if China is the new Soviet Union. This, of course, is nonsense. Just because both the CPC and the Soviet Communist Party have communist in their name doesn't mean that they are the same. In fact, they could hardly be more different. The Chinese Communist Party enjoyed hugely deeper roots amongst the people. It has displayed a remarkable ability to reinvent itself, which the Soviet Communist Party singly failed to do. Take the question of the Communist Party of China. Instead of thinking of it as a clone of the Soviet Communist Party, the West should be making a serious attempt to analyze why it is the most successful political party of the modern era. It is a new kind of party, the largest in the world, which is redefining the very concept of a political party. Committed to meritocracy, a fundamental value, of course, of Chinese governance since Confucius. It represents the best, the most competent, the most far-sighted elements in Chinese society. Far from being monolithic and narrowly based, the Communist Party of China is deeply rooted in Chinese society, an authentic product and expression of Chinese civilization, a hybrid of Marxism and Confucianism. It combines, in a unique way, pragmatism, seek truth from facts, with an ability to think far ahead. This is a most remarkable achievement. It's claimed in the West one-party system will ultimately fail, as happened in the Soviet Union. Really? Is this really the case? Let's go back to 1978. The Chinese economy grew considerably under Mao Zedong, but not as fast as Japan and South Korea, for example. By the time of Mao's death, China was still very poor. Deng Xiaoping believed that China needed to and could grow much faster. He made two fundamental changes. Chinese socialism should embrace the market as well as the state and planet, and that China should abandon the policy of going it alone in favour of integrating itself with the rest of the world and becoming part of the global economy. These two proposals marked a huge shift in thinking and policy, far more radical than anything that has been attempted in any major Western society since 1945. And the author and architect of this change? The Communist Party of China. Now, there's an even more dramatic and fundamental example of China's ability to change and reinvent itself. China is quite exceptional in that over the last 2,000 years, it hasn't had not just one period when it has been the most advanced or one of the most advanced societies in the world. There have been 5 separate periods. The Han, Tang, Song perhaps, part of the Ming, and also the early Qing. China has been able to reinvent itself and rise to a position of eminence or preeminence not once, but 5 times. And now, China is under the leadership of the Communist Party of China of achieving this for a 6th time. China has been far superior to anywhere else, and certainly the West, over the last 2 millennia at reinventing itself. Let me finish with this thought. There's a growing crisis of governance in the West. We should not really be surprised. The West is in decline. China is on the rise. The centre of gravity of economic power has been remorselessly shifting eastwards. The result has been growing discontent in the West about their leaders, their governments, their political parties, and their governing institutions. The United States is a dramatic example of this. It is now deeply divided and highly polarized. The West has much to learn from China about governments. I will give one example. When the West talks about governments, it refers only to how governments are selected, never to the competence of governments, the ability of governments to perform and deliver for the people. Competence, or the lack of it, is the Achilles heel of Western governance. In contrast, competence is absolutely fundamental to the Chinese concept of governance. And China's extraordinary history and remarkable transformation since 1949, and especially 1978, demonstrates how fundamental this is for a country and its people. Thank you very much.
好，我们进入互动问答环节。
How do we address of lies used to vilify the Chinese people and the Chinese government and the Chinese nation?
China will show by its own actions and its own achievements that these are lies. This is just deliberate deception.
西方主流的媒体和学界对于中国的观察还是带有一定的偏见的，这些偏见是否能被自然消解呢？
Hi, can you hear us? It's great. Okay. So, thank you very much, Martin, for your very thoughtful, impressive, well-argued presentation. And so now we're going to have a Q&A. We're going to have some questions for you, perhaps also for me. And many of them have already read your book, and also your many articles were published in Chinese in China. So let's give the floor to our audience. Shall we start with Charles?
Great, Martin. It's a fantastic presentation. We're faced with the issue of what is happening in the world today in terms of attitude toward China. So we have a problem of falsehood or factual distortions and lies coming from Western politicians. Take, for example, the issue of forced labor in Xinjiang. Over 80% of the cotton picked in Xinjiang is by machines, by harvesters, not by physical labor. But now it's become a big thing. Xinjiang is using forced labor. All these things are lies and distortions which are spreading all over the world by politicians. The Chinese people look at it and say, this is absurd. It's totally crazy, especially after how the Chinese government handled the pandemic. But how do we address this issue or this problem? Both Martin and Professor Zhang, lies used to vilify the Chinese people and the Chinese government and Chinese nation. It's gotten quite serious.
Well, I mean, the point that you make is not exaggerated. It is true. Negativity towards China has become very fashionable over the last several years. It starts really with the American administration, particularly the Trump administration, and their shift to a much more negative view about China. The worst example is the attitude towards China and the pandemic. I mean, a year ago, in January, February, March, I mean, the tumult of negativity and rejection towards China, accusations of secrecy, cover-up, that the government didn't care about the people, and so on. Then, of course, eventually they were silenced, more or less, by the fact that it was clearly evident that the West was the miserable failure and China had been a huge success on these things. But they never apologized or showed any contrition. So how do we deal with this? Well, I think that we've entered a new phase, and I think China also is in a learning mode about how to handle it. I mean, first of all, China will show by its own actions and its own achievements that these are lies. This is just deliberate deception. Secondly, I think that it's very important that China develops its relations with across the world in the best way possible. You know, I think that this is a very important investment. Relations vary. You know, if you're talking about developing world, that's one issue. If you're talking about the Western world, which is the big problem in this context, that's another issue. And then to distinguish, when it comes to the West, between the United States and Europe. There is no doubt that Europeans do not share the China threat theory in the way that Americans can do. So I think that we have to, you know, the way China handles this situation is also very important. And sometimes, you know, when they come out with the most outrageous lies and so on, it's not always best to answer back. Sometimes it's best, you know, to pass it by, to rise above it. Don't jump. You know, Trump's gone now, thank God. But don't join Trump in the gutter. Never stoop to that level. But, you know, China's a great country, great culture, offering a huge amount to the world in the future, even more to the world.
OK，Thank you。我就简单补充一下，我觉得马丁讲的我非常赞成。实际上，世界上的国家情况非常复杂，社交媒体起来之后，让这种谣言散布的特别快。今天西方已经把中国通过这个谣言，这个污蔑的如此之这个荒唐啊，以至于就是我觉得只要我们能够普普通通的老百姓把日常生活每天的你的跑步、你的 shopping， 你用手机购货支付，然后你的这个广场舞，哪怕你这个美食，这些图啊、视频啊晒上去，这个东西一旦出去有它颠覆性的，不用谈政治，不用谈民主，就谈日常生活，就谈这个东西。但怎么做，我们要动脑筋。我觉得就是要有章法，但是最终是要动员人民，不要光是官方的平台也很重要，他们发挥他们的作用，但是普通老百姓更重要，它更真实。
就是越开放，中国老百姓越看到欧美的一些这个主流媒体是多荒唐，
对，
多荒谬。
对，我觉得就是一个大的思路，就恐怕是通过网络，在他们这个认为他们还占优势地方，把它给击败。我觉得这个是我们要努力的方向，一步步来做。Daniel, please.
Thank you for that talk. I'm Daniel Dumbrell. I've been here in China for 12 years. And for me, it seems like the West, at least the people in power, they seem to be getting more and more self-conscious. I think that's why they censored the PBS documentary on poverty alleviation in China. They pulled it because it showed China in too positive of a light. Should China come out a little bit more, make these direct comparisons, not only to hopefully encourage the West to learn some positive things from China, but also to push back from the people who think that there's no merit to China's system. China's just an evil system because it doesn't have democracy. For those two reasons, do you think it's a good opportunity?
I think China has to be firm, has to be explanatory, has to be proactive. Along the lines that you suggest, I agree with that. I think that there's great ignorance about China now at the moment. Most people in the West, frankly, know very little about China. And then, the Cold War legacy is still in people's minds after all these years. The word communist is still a dirty word. So the problem is, where do you start when people know so little? I think that might concern climate change. On climate change, there is a sort of growing incremental process of cooperation between the two countries. This will be important in two respects. One, it hugely enhances the fight against climate change. And secondly, it helps to develop a more positive attitude towards China, at least in this area.
Thank you. 我也补充一点，我觉得这个我们在国际交流中。
for the great majority of people in the world who live in developing countries. That is 85% of the world's population. The West has a set relationship, a set mentality about the developing world, a view, in the West, there's a hierarchy of nations. At the top is the West, and the West has the right to run the world. The West dominates so-called international institutions, even now. And so the West has got to learn, will this happen? Look, I think slowly, grudgingly, the West will be dragged, kicking and screaming along this road. But don't underestimate the sheer inertia of privilege, of 200 years of global domination. The West cannot think outside its box. Why has it suddenly turned against China like this? Because it feels the world that it created, the Western world, is under threat from the rise of China. But not just China, it's all the developing countries. So the world is being transformed, before our eyes. This is not an exaggeration. It's moving with great historical speed.
就是过去几年在西方做讲座的时候，我经常讲这个。我说中国已经从西方学了很多，现在还在学，以后还要学。但我觉得现在我讲的非常坦率，你们在很多地方要向中国学习。我说中国，特别是整个改革开放过程中，有2条非常重要的经验。第一条是解放思想，就刚才马丁讲的 think outside the box， 要真的开始拥抱新的思想，有这个胆量跟不同的想法思路进行接触，然后如果是好的就拥抱它。第二呢，能不能实事求是？所以一个解放思想，一个实事求是，这2条经验对世界都适用，对西方也适用。如果你违背这2条，你自己将一路走衰。这基本上这样的。
大家好，张教授好，有个问题想请教您，就是说，纵观现在西方主流的媒体和学界，其实他们对于中国的观察还是带有一定的偏见的。您认为这些偏见究其根本它是怎样产生的，以及通过我们的不断发展和综合国力的提升，您认为这些偏见是否能被自然消解呢？
我觉得西方对中国的偏见，大致几个原因啊。一个是我经常讲的，就是这个他们文化的基因啊，是源于一神教。一神教呢，就相信一个上帝，一个真理。你不信我这个教，你是异教徒，你是我的敌人。所以西方文化中，他们很难接受。你也对的，我也对的，大家都肯定有道理，这个是很中国的一个思维方法。还有一个意识形态原因，因为这个在我们崛起之前，当时主要是冷战，整个苏联阵营叫社会主义阵营和美国为代表西方阵营一直在尖锐的斗争，所以他们做了大量的这个反共的宣传，一直认为中国共产党就像苏联共产党一样，中国就像过去的苏联。你到东欧去，你知道他们认为中国就是放大的东德，真这么认为的。那么这就导致这个意识形态偏见非常顽固，这个很不容易去掉。那么是不是随着中国的崛起，就自然而然他们就会接受中国了？这个人的思维方法，这个宗教传统文化改变非常非常难的，可能要很多很多年，几十年甚至更长时间。
I am absolutely confident that what is going to happen is China will continue to rise, continue to grow more powerful. Now, let me just say one other thing. And that is, in a way, what we're witnessing is a contest about modernity. There is a classic view in the West about modernity. There is only one kind of modernity. It is the modernity of the West. If you want to get modern, you've got to become Western. But that has never been true, actually, never been true in history, in my view, of modernity. Modernity is not just economic. It's political, it's cultural, and so on. And so increasingly, in my view, China will become the kind of yardstick, the exemplar of what modernity is. In the longer run, China's gravitational pull because of its success, will draw more and more people around the world, including in the West, to look at it as a model, not to copy it, but as a way of living and a set of norms and values which they too want to share and aspire to.
Great, thank you. It's a great occasion that we have already discussed all that many issues, and thank you very much for your contributions. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed the questions, very interesting questions, made me think a lot, and of course it's great for us to be together again, Jiang Weiwei, even though we're so far apart. See you soon.
See you. All the best. Okay. 今年是中国共产党成立100周年，世界正面临100年未有之大变局。如何理解中国共产党？如何理解中国道路？如何理解中国共产党中国道路和中华民族伟大复兴之间的关系？那么在这个节目里，我想我会对话西方学者，会邀请真正懂中国道路的一些专家，力求呢把中国共产党讲得清清楚楚。只有读懂中国共产党，才能读懂中国。
闪耀东方由世界因我而不同四特东方韵冠名播出。
我们今天讨论的主题是剖析西方对中国的误读，也就是讨论西方为什么老是读不懂中国。1996年2月的时候，当时呢，西方媒体都在说中国即将崩溃，一个背景就是小平同志确实是病重了，已经将近2年时间没有在公众舞台上出现。他们咨询了美国的中国问题专家，50%都认为中国在邓小平之后会出现类似苏联解体那样的解体和崩溃。那么我看了这个报告，我觉得离谱离得厉害，他们没有读懂中国，所以我就给亚洲华尔街日报投稿写这篇文章，它还登出来了。这个标题是 China Center will hold， 就中国实际上它这个凝聚力非常强，不会这个分裂。我特别花一些时间讲的就是通过经济改革之后，那么实际上这个统一的市场正在形成之中。中国企业家在95年时已经非常清醒地意识到，中国就是他们自己的最大的市场。所以我说，这个中国的改革开放实际上创造更多的凝聚力，而不是更多的离心力。所以这也是一个历史见证。我们最早在那个时候和所谓中国崩溃论开始了比战，来产生了比较积极的影响。好，就和大家谈这些，谢谢大家。
East Asian societies believe in good governance. We as human beings have human rights. We also have human responsibilities. And we need to understand that we need to take care of the global boat as a whole.
我们是不是可以认为有一场新的文明的冲突即将发生？
So if the Western states can start learning from Asia, then there will not be a clash of civilization.
如果美国的疫情得不到控制的话，可不可以认为这是美国时代终结的前兆？
个人认为，我们进入后美国时代，这个已经进入了。中国是联合国的创始国之一，我们强调以联合国为中心的世界秩序，而不是美国人讲的这个少数他自己维护的那个所谓规则和秩序。